the way a risk evolved over time, we talk about how sustainability concepts evolved and then it became conscious about environmental concerns. And as I said, history is interesting and worth following, and then one has to think about whether all these meetings and the evolution of the environmental sense have actually resulted in any action, or are the actions really as rapid as the climate change that we are causing and the impacts that are accruing, especially on the most vulnerable countries, poor countries, right? So continue with sustainability, Stockholm 1972. After a few decades of focusing mainly on the fragile peace after World War II, the United Nations answered the suggestion from Sweden to hold a first World Conference on Development and Environment. It was called the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment and was held in Stockholm in 1972. We'll see a figure. The figures are just kind of props. They are not really indicative all the time. The figure of a city of Shanghai, as we saw, and so on. Although the height of the Cold War resulted in Soviet Union and most of its allies not attending, the conference still brought together representatives of 113 states, both developed and developing, and a number of UN agencies, other intergovernmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations. So the Cold War and the Eastern Bloc kept on playing into all global issues as well. The conference placed the environment onto the global agenda and produced a declaration with 26 principles and an action plan with 119 recommendations. The cynical view is that there are too many conventions on biodiversity, disaster management, and sustainability, and so on, but the action doesn't always follow, often because of the barriers of finance, capabilities, skills, plans, strategies, mainstreaming of these actions into fiscal policies, and so on and so forth. When looking at the principles of the Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, also referred to as the Stockholm Declaration, it's clear that the conference defined human environment broader than the more traditional notions of the environment. The first principle focuses on the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate living conditions in an environment that permits a life of dignity and well-being. So if you read the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, these come through there in more details in terms of access to water, energy, education, equality, and so on and so forth. It explicitly states that the apartheid, however it's pronounced, racial segregation, discrimination, and all forms of oppression and domination must be condemned and eliminated. The last principle calls for the abolition of weapons of mass destruction, and so on. So I won't read the rest of it. It's basically a summary of all the scope of the meeting and the declarations. For example, human settlements and urbanization must be planned with a view to avoid adverse effects on the environment and to obtain maximum social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. Obviously, since then, the urbanization has continued unabated, population densities have increased, role of the urban centers on climate change is disproportionately high, and the impacts of climate change on urban centers correspond to these disproportionate concentration of people, infrastructure, urban heat islands, impacts on extreme events, and so on and so forth. So again and again it becomes clear that global negotiations are very important, very critical, but converting them into action remains always a major challenge. Okay, so here is another prop: old town of Stockholm, which is a beautiful place, expensive as hell for people who don't have a lot of money, but nonetheless. The Stockholm Declaration highlights the utmost importance of research, innovation, and education, which is good. It specifies that science and technology must be applied to the identification, avoidance, and control of environmental risks and the solution of environmental problems for the common good of humankind. Research and development in environmental problems must be promoted everywhere, especially in developing countries, and the open access to and transfer of knowledge and solutions must be facilitated and supported. This is again still going on in terms of loss and damage negotiations under the UNFCCC, how rich countries should or you know can compensate poorer countries which are facing very high impacts of climate change and so on. So jumping to Rio de Janeiro 1992, 20 years after Stockholm, the turn had come to Brazil compared to its predecessor, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 was a sizable event. So the conferences have grown in size, especially if you think about the Conference of Parties that happened in Dubai a few months ago. The attendance was something like 80,000 people, and all flying sometimes with private jets, and many of them are just there to lobby for continued use of energy, fossil fuels, and so on. So you have to be careful about what these conferences are about and how it attracts people who want to make sure that their business is not greatly affected by the decisions made at these meetings. The conference, which is often referred to as the Earth Summit, had representatives from 172 states, which jumped up from before, including 118 heads of state or governments, and from thousands of non-governmental organizations. So the stakeholder groups who saw their role in having agency in these negotiations or meetings increased and continues to increase. It resulted in the It resulted in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which I focus on in this brief section, as well as in Agenda 21, a non-binding action plan for sustainable development, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity were also opened for signatures at the conference, which are key legally binding agreements concerning two central aspects for the sustainability of our planet. As we discussed extensively in adaptation, unless there is data, continuous gathering of data to monitor and evaluate progress on these conventions, and ensuring that finance and other expertise are available to make them possible, they just become conventions, which unfortunately is what happens most of the time. So let's briefly read the creation of the environmental conscience at the UN system, One of the results of the 1972 Stockholm Conference was the recommendation to create a small secretariat for environmental action and coordination within the United Nations system. Like in adaptation, even if a country wants to do something or a university campus wants to do net zero, sustainability, adaptation, and so on, you need dedicated offices with a tracking of progress and implementation, planning, strategies, financing, etc. And that's the same at global level as well. This leads already later that year to the establishment of the United Nations Environment Program, which since then has grown into a large international organization with its headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya, 6 regional offices and numerous country offices. UN is often blamed for having ballooning bureaucracies in everything, but regional centers are critical because climate change impacts are very location specific, and the associated environmental and sustainability issues are very location specific as well, and implementation will all be very local. UNEP's mission is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, and enabling nations and peoples to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. As I said before, this statement is very true. It is a truism, a motherhood statement. How to convert it to action and rules and regulations and norms and punishments, that's not so obvious, as we'll see with the planetary boundary as well. Its work encompasses assessing environmental conditions and trends, developing international and national environmental instruments, strengthening institutions for the wise management of the environment, facilitating the transfer of knowledge and technology for sustainable development, and encouraging new partnerships and mindsets within the civil society and private sector. UNEP's current priority areas are climate change, disasters and conflicts, ecosystem management, environmental governance, harmful substances, and resource efficiency. Is it good to bring so many agenda items into one umbrella? There is arguments made against it because then dilution happens in terms of tracking, responsibility, managing, strategizing, etc. But UNEP produces some very nice reports from these activities, and I have summarized some of them elsewhere. Okay, so here is another prop: Rio de Janeiro, beautiful city, great food, great music, and so on. So the conference had been preceded by so this is about Rio. Rio de Janeiro 1992. The conference had been preceded by a decade of intense work, laying the foundation for the concept of sustainable development as we know it. First, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, IUCN, published their World Conservation Strategy, declaring conservation to be intrinsically linked to development and the alleviation of poverty of hundreds of millions of people. So this concept still continues with the Millennium Goals that expired, I think, in 2000, then the or maybe 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are set to mature in 2030, and so on. In other words, unless the health and productivity of the planet are protected, all humankind is at risk. Then a few years later, the World Commission on Environment and Development was created and constituted as an independent body by the General Assembly of the United Nations. After years of work, they published in 1987 the highly influential report called Our Common Future, which is considered the founding source for the concept of sustainable development as inherently linking social, environmental, and economic aspects. The table was, in other words, set for fruitful conference, for a fruitful conference. So maybe I'll summarize the report, Our Common Future, if I find the time. So here is the sustainable development entails social, environmental, and economic aspects idea coming out of Rio de Janeiro. So sustainability, environmental, economy, so society sits here. Economist Herman Daly has railed against it, has actually he was a very gentle guy, passed away recently, never railed against anything, but has written very influential papers and proposed concepts reminding us that we cannot think of environment as one component of society and economy. We should remember that society and economy actually happen within the environment. So the larger the society, larger the economy, little is the space left for the environment and its preservation, conservation, and so on. So this concept is actually not so great if you ask me. Okay, so this has a few more points. Maybe I'll just read this and conclude this podcast. Rio Declaration states that countries should work together to promote a supportive and open international economic system which would lead to sustainable development by economic growth and better management of environmental degradation in all countries. And there are other details which I won't read, but the declaration states that if activities in one country may have significant adverse effects on the environment in another, they should consult each other at an early stage and in good faith. Does this work? Well, when you have conflicts like Russia and Ukraine, Hamas and Israel, obviously, or there are mistrusts like in the Indian subcontinent and China, then these are obviously much more difficult. Although good news is that often the geopolitical conflicts and social, economically driven, not conflicts but distrust, actually doesn't affect negotiations on the environmental front, because both countries or multiple countries may realize the combined destiny in terms of environment affecting everybody's well-being economically as well. So this is also applicable for natural disasters or other emergencies that are likely to produce sudden harmful transboundary effects on the environment, and the international community is obliged to make every effort to assist countries affected. Is that working? Well, we still continue. Sendai framework for disaster management is something we'll briefly come back to later. The Rio Declaration states explicitly that development, environmental protection, and peace are intrinsically linked, and that armed conflict is inherently destructive of sustainable development. Countries are thus obliged to resolve all their environmental disputes peacefully, protect the environment and natural resources of people under oppression, domination, and occupation, and respect international law, providing protection for the environment in times of armed conflict. None of this really works if you look at the conflicts that have continued to occur over the century, and uh, efforts to monitor the impacts continue under the UN umbrella, and how successful they are is something we have to worry about. So we'll come back and look at the next step, which is Johannesburg 2002. And the timing is good because the cleaners are just walking in, and I have to stop this here anyways.